Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both guests for being here and taking such great care with your presentations. And I thought, just to sort of announce where I'd like to try to get in 7 minutes, with Mr. Brock, I appreciate that you had a couple of other recommendations that you didn't have time to cover in your remarks, and I wanted to ask you about two of them at least. And with Mr. Archer in particular, just to go a little bit more into the where to vote card, but I'll come to that in just a sec. So, Mr. Brock, I was glad to see that you've been reading the bill close enough that you are a little bit concerned, or maybe a lot concerned, about the fact that Clause 10, with the new Section 20 of the Act, would allow the Chief Electoral Officer to engage the service of persons having technical or specialized knowledge of any matter relating to the Chief Electoral Officer temporarily, but in order for them to be remunerated, the Treasury Board would have to approve. Just to take an example, the Auditor General doesn't have that kind of constraint on what he or she can do by way of hiring temporary specialists, and I believe can draw directly on the Consolidated Revenue Fund for that purpose. So I'm just wondering if you could speak briefly, and maybe Mr. Archer, if you also have any thoughts on that, on is this an inappropriate insertion of government budgetary decision-making in the realm of a parliamentary officer?
Great. Thank you for that question. Thank you for raising one of the matters that was addressed in my brief, but I didn't have time to address in my opening statement. Perhaps I can say three things about the provision that would require Treasury Board approval to remunerate officials working for Elections Canada to provide technical assistance or other specialized knowledge. One is, I think it's difficult to discern from the bill as it's currently written how that might be applied, because we have no cases of implementation to draw upon. So in some ways I'm working from an understanding of what I think the implication of the bill would be, but we may have a better we would have a better understanding if this was implemented, and my hope is that it won't be, as I've made clear in the brief. There's two issues here, I think. One is that Elections Canada often engages individuals in the area of research or in specialized technical work within the institution, and they're very good about publishing the results of that work. I, as Chief Electoral Officer in a smaller jurisdiction by number of electors, and in this case even by geography, rely upon that work because Elections NWT has nowhere near the capacity of Elections Canada to produce that kind of what is really world-class research on electoral behavior and election administration. In addition to that, I don't believe that university academics would fill that gap because having spent some time in that area, and Dr. Archer knows this better than anyone, political scientists or others are mandated to respond to gaps in the theoretical literature, not necessarily to address public policy challenges that Elections Canada or the Parliament of Canada may be facing in a very short amount of time. My final point is, and this is one that I think is fundamental to a few points in a few provisions in the bill. I think it's important in this country to think carefully about what's the relationship between officers of Parliament, or in my case officers of a legislative assembly, and the executive. I think going back to 1920, the understanding was that we needed to have an impartial body that did not have an accountability or reporting requirement to the government, but rather had that requirement to the legislature. And Elections Canada is perhaps the strongest example of that in the world. My concern with this provision is, as perhaps inconsequential as it could be in the long term, depending on how it's implemented, that it fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between Elections Canada and the Parliament of Canada. The Office of the Chief Electoral Officer is not an arm of the Executive. The Office of the Chief Electoral Officer is an agent of Parliament. And I think the accountability relationship and the responsibility is owed to Parliament as a whole.
Thank you. And Mr. Archer, if you could briefly make a comment, because I want to now go to the where to vote cards issue.
Sure. Let me give you a couple of examples of recent spending that our office was involved in to illustrate how I understand the relationship between the office and the Legislative Assembly and or government with respect to spending initiatives. I mentioned in my comments that we sponsored a conference on the 2013 provincial election, and we did it with the University of British Columbia. For us, that was part of our event funding, because understanding the determinants of people's civic engagement, for example, was an important element in the event. And so when the funding is allocated for a project like that, it is part of the statutory spending that the office has, that I report on to the Legislative Assembly as event funding in advance of the event, and then report on subsequently after the event. When I was involved in a recent panel on internet voting, it was an interesting evolution of that project, because I was requested to do that by the Minister of Justice. And it was important for me to ensure that I wasn't reporting to, and this panel wasn't reporting to, a government ministry, but rather to the Legislative Assembly. So I agreed to head up the panel, but under the condition that I would select the panelists, that I would approach the Legislative Committee for funding for the work of the panel, and that ultimately the report of the panel went to the Legislative Assembly as a whole and not to a government ministry. So the independence of the office is reflected in a number of our activities, whether they're event activities or special projects.
Thank you. And with my last 30 seconds, Professor Archer, if somebody were to receive a Where to Vote card that says John Smith, but John Smith lived there before and their name is John Brown, and then they waltzed off to vote, how would they have to commit fraud with that card? Would they be able to vote that way?
Right. So if I have time to expand on this answer a little bit, the broader question is...
You truly don't. But that's
given that there's a large number of items that are Type 2 identity documents, if you have somebody else's Type 2 identity document, are you able to use that and go vote fraudulently?
right.
And the answer is you do so at great risk to yourself, and there's a very good likelihood that you're not going to be successful, whether it's with your voter information card or whether it's with the library card that you happen to find in the lobby of your condo building as well. Impersonating someone else with their Type 2 identity document is a serious offense in British Columbia, subject to a fine of $20,000 and 2 years in jail.
Well, thank you, Mr. Archer, and I've given some extra time for that, so remember we did that.